Hi, everybody. I want to start in a slightly different way. I just want to say that I hope everybody's doing well, staying healthy, physically, mentally, emotionally. It's a tough time, so I just hope everybody's hanging in there. Take care of yourselves. So what I'd like to do here is show a demo of some enhancements to Illuminated Cloud, in particular around the way that metadata is synchronized between the local project and the organization, in particular for two different organization types, sandbox organizations and scratch organizations. And I'm just going to jump straight into the demo because I think it will actually make this more clear than a whole lot of prefacing. So let's do that. So here is a project I've set up, and I've set it up against a sandbox organization. And as you can see on the toolbar, the way that you're going to move metadata back and forth between the local project and that sandbox organization is going to be based on the more fine-grained options for doing things like deployment, retrieval, metadata removal, things like that have been there pretty much since Illuminated Cloud was first launched. So you can start a bulk deployment or a bulk retrieval. It'll show the dialog to choose exactly what subset of metadata that you want, or if you want, you can just use deploy on save, which we can see down here in the status bar, and it'll try to choose an optimal deployment path for that to the organization. Well, as of summer 2020, Salesforce has provided an enhancement. It's currently in a beta state for sandbox organizations where they can be enabled for source tracking. And source tracking, if you're not familiar with it, is the same mechanism that allows scratch orgs to work such that you don't really have to care about the manifest or you don't have to explicitly care about the manifest that describes your metadata relative to the organizations, like a package XML. You don't necessarily have to keep explicit track of the changes you've made locally versus the changes in the server. You use two primary primitives, for source push and for source pull, to make the organization look like the local project for the former, and make the project look like the declarative changes you've made in the organization for the latter. And it uses source tracking information in order to actually take care of all that. And so that feature is now available for sandboxes. And so if we go in to Illuminated Cloud now and edit the connection properties, you can now enable a sandbox connection to use push and pull, to use source tracking, instead of deploy, retrieve, and delete. Now, one thing I want to say before we leave this dialog is that this will only work for OAuth connections to your sandboxes. So if you've created a native connection, one of those that is created this way, it will not work for that. And the reason hopefully is pretty obvious, and that is as soon as you check this and say OK, Illuminated Cloud is going to begin using the CLI's for source push and for source pull capabilities in order to move metadata back and forth. And that will not be aware of any Illuminated Cloud native connection. It needs to be something that the CLI is already aware of. And so it needs to be a CLI OAuth connection to that sandbox. Similarly, because push and pull only work against source format projects, this will not work against metadata format projects. So if you haven't already, you'll need to convert your metadata format project to source format, and then you'll be able to use sandbox source tracking against the metadata for that project. All right, so let's just go ahead and confirm that. And if we look at the toolbar, we can see that the buttons have changed, and now the primary interaction model is based on push and pull. For a while now, I've allowed interactions with scratch orgs to also do these more fine-grained, low-level deployment, retrieval, delete operations. But it does require you to explicitly initiate the operation. It's not something that's bound to a key binding. So with push and pull, you can see the keyboard shortcuts. You can see that those are missing on these operations. So I could go to the toolbar, or if I wanted to, I could bring them up in, say, one of the quick actions. But the point is it's not automatically bound to a key binding. Well, now if I press Control S or Command S on a Mac, it will, notice down here, begin a push operation. And one other thing I want to make you aware of, and that's exactly what's happened, is if you are using source tracking and you make metadata changes out of band of that, so if we turned off this and used raw metadata deployment instead of for source push, or if we use for source deploy from the command line, or whatever you happen to use, then the source tracking information is out of date, and you will be presented with this dialog saying that there are potential conflicts, and you will need to resolve those conflicts, whether that's on push or pull. It's going to recognize that things have been modified on the server and locally, and push or pull is not safe to do without reconciling that. This is the way that the CLI generally works, but it becomes more pronounced whenever you've got an out-of-band path to get metadata updated on one location or the other. So in this case, I know that things are fine. I'm just going to go ahead and accept that and tell it that excuse me, I want to accept the metadata changes that I have locally, and you can see that things completed successfully. And if I save again, then we should see that there were no changes. So all files are up to date. And similarly, if I do a pull, we should see in just a moment that everything's up to date from a pull perspective as well, because I haven't made any changes in the server. Now, I do want to mention that because one, this is a beta feature on the Salesforce platform in summer 2020, and two, because you now have the ability to interact with the org both using source tracking and not using source tracking, you might find yourself in a state that push and pull don't actually get you back into the right state. If that's the case, then the CLI actually has some commands for fixing that, for source tracking clear and reset, I believe. If you use those, read the fine print very carefully. They exist in order to resolve these types of situations, but understand that they will erase some of this source tracking information or all of it, depending upon the command that you use. So just understand what you're doing before you execute it. But that really becomes your hammer if you find yourself in a state where push and pull simply cannot work any longer because it's saying that it can't figure out how to reconcile local versus server. Okay, so as you can see, you now have the ability in Illuminated Cloud to work with a sandbox as if it were not so much a scratch org, because a sandbox is not ephemeral in nature, but a source tracked org where you don't necessarily have to explicitly care about the relationships between the local metadata, project metadata, and the organization metadata, and instead the source tracking information will take care of that for you. Well, let's take a look at the flip side of that. So I'm going to change my project. Instead of using a sandbox connection, I'm going to use a scratch org connection. So this is an ephemeral organization that was created. It was blank when it was created. I've since populated it with this project's metadata. So we're just going to make some incremental changes to it. And so we flipped over to that scratch org, and you can see that the toolbar correctly reflects its nature as a scratch org project. So push and pull is your primary interaction model. And then you do have kind of bypass capabilities to get to the more fine-grained metadata deployment retrieval removal capabilities. Again, if I press Control S or Command S, or if I start a push or a pull, it's going to go out and actually do that. In this case, everything was up to date. Let's make a change and see if it presents us with a conflict. It may or may not. Yeah, so it presents them with a conflict because the last time I tried this demo against this organization, I did it using the more fine-grained capabilities. Excuse me. And so now we'll tell it can go ahead and force those conflicts, and it will take care of that. All right, so what if we wanted to interact with the scratch org as if it were not a scratch org? And there may be several reasons for doing that. So I'll discuss a few of them in turn. So let's go into the connection settings, and you can see there's a scratch org. And again, you can see there's this new checkbox, use, deploy, retrieve, delete, instead of push, pull. So it's really the reverse of the previous message. Treat it as a non-scratch org instead of a scratch org for purposes of metadata synchronization. So I'm going to check that, and I'm going to say OK. You can see that the toolbar is now changed, and it looks like a non-scratch org toolbar. There aren't even push and pull icons there. We only interact with this as if it were a non-scratch org using very fine-grained, sitting just on top of the API, deploy, retrieve, delete capabilities. So again, if I do Control S, we can see down here it's deploying. And because it has access to the tooling API, and because it doesn't have to take the entire project's metadata into account, and therefore try to reconcile the entire project's metadata with the org metadata, it can be very fast. Now, to be fair, Salesforce has made a huge amount of progress on the performance of for-source push, and I'm sure that that gap will continue to narrow. But for now, assuming that the tooling API queues are behaving well, they're not always, but assuming they're behaving well, this will be the first reason you might want to do this, is more efficient deploy, retrieve, delete, because you're not having to do that monolithic all or nothing, always considering server versus org state, even though Illuminated Cloud does do a decent amount of that as well for conflict detection purposes and things like that. You're not necessarily having to do all that every time that you save or deploy. You can immediately bring up these very flexible capabilities to do deployments and do retrievals and do metadata removal. You're not just relying on the source tracking API to figure out the differences. Sometimes only you really know what it is that you want to do. Here's a good reason you may want to do this. While you would hope this would never be the case, once in a while you can find yourself in a catch-22 situation trying to populate an organization. That can happen when you first populate that organization because you have metadata that will partially deploy. Then you may have to go fix some things. Then you want to only deploy the things that have not been deployed yet or that have been updated by fixing things, and kind of wash, rinse, repeat until the org's properly populated. Now, that's obviously not the state you want to be in for the recurring cycle of working in Scratch org development, but it is the reality of, for example, migrating metadata from a happy soup environment into Scratch orgs. And you really can't do that with force source push because it is an all or nothing proposition. It takes all the metadata and it tries to deploy it. And if one fails, they all fail. And this gives you the ability to do partial commits. You can say, ignore errors and warnings, commit what will commit, report on anything that won't, and let me continue to iterate until I have things right. And that's not just during initial org population. If you've done a large-scale refactoring, you can also find that the source tracking API simply cannot figure out what to do with some of the changes and will fail. It's rare, but it happens. And again, this gives you the ability to brute force things into a correct state in a very fine-grained manner. And then the third reason is that some people, and I count myself among those that fall into this category, simply like to know more about what's happening. So if I'm going to deploy, retrieve, delete some set of files, if I use force source push and force source pull, there's a lot that the CLI is doing without me really understanding it, even turning on debug logging. And then when it fails, it's difficult for me to figure out exactly what actions I need to take. If I can very discreetly choose the metadata I want to send over, if I get very discrete errors and warnings as a result of that, if I can take just a subset of the things that I'm working on and only do retrieve for merge on those and figure out the differences, the relationship between the local project metadata and the server metadata, if I can do a very, very selective delete of metadata from the server and compare, I want to only get rid of things that are in the server that are not in the local project. So not subscribed, server only. And now I can see the things that are only on the server and I want to check those and get rid of them. I feel like I have more control over what's going on. That may or may not be true as source tracking gets better, but I've definitely found situations where I had to drop to this model in order to put things into the desired state. So those are just some of the reasons you might want to do this and use the more traditional mechanisms for interacting with an org, even though it's a Scratch org. So these capabilities are now available. The idea is that Illuminated Cloud should be able to allow you to interact with a target organization using whatever models are available for that organization. And so for sandbox organizations, as demonstrated in the first part of this demo, that can be the traditional model with deploy, retrieve, delete in a more fine-grained sense, or now in a beta source tracked. And with Scratch orgs, by default, they're going to be source tracked. But if you want to work with them as basically time bombing ephemeral developer edition organizations, you can now do that just by setting up your Scratch org organization to say, I want to treat it as a non-Scratch org. Right now, you can't do that with true developer edition organizations. You can't do that with production organizations, trial organizations. As Salesforce rolls out source tracking to other organization types, Illuminated Cloud will support it. But right now, only Scratch orgs and sandbox organizations can be used with source tracking. So I hope you find these useful. I hope they give you more flexibility in the way that you do your development work against your organizations. And obviously, if you find any issues, let me know about them, and I'll try to take care of them as soon as possible and get new releases out that effectively make this the new model of record. Thanks a lot, and just repeating what I said earlier, everybody stay healthy, stay safe, and take care of yourself.